A year ago today, if you asked One Piece fans how strong they thought the Gods Knights would be, you would have gotten some pretty wild answers. Some people had admiral level expectations from the whole crew. Fast forward to today, and they're kind of fighting YC3 allegations. It's been a rough ride for the Gods Knights. So what has changed over the course of this year? Well, it's complicated. Oda seems to have kind of made a 180 on his portrayal of most of these characters. So we're left with a problem, and I am a man who specializes in solutions. So let's run through the Gods Knights problem and then theorize two potential solutions to fix the portrayal of the Gods Knights. Let's cook. So when you have a character like Dragon introduce us to the concept of the Gods Knights, you kind of build a certain level of expectations. When you have a twin brother and the father of Shanks be a part of this organization, you build a certain level of expectation. Then when you have Gonko solo half of the crew, including Jinbei, by the way, who y'all said was stronger than Sanji, but whatever, you build a certain level of expectations. But at one point, these expectations get away from reality. And it all started during the God Valley flashback. So many fans expected Garling's title of Champion of God Valley to hold some type of real weight, and not to mention he's also Shanks' dad. That's pretty important. But boy, I don't think I've ever seen any stocks crash the way that Garling stocks crashed during that flashback. Like, people like Kid, Kid losing to Shanks, cool. It was disappointing for Kid fans, but it makes sense. Law, you losing to Blackbeard. Like, these are things, stock-wise, yes, they drop, but it kind of makes sense. But being told that this guy is the champion of God Valley, an arc that involved major players like Garp, Roger, Rox, etc. For that performance, whew, man, he was embarrassed time and time again. But granted, he was embarrassed by Rox D. Zebek. Even still, this title coming from a place of fraudulence was kind of like a red flag for this faction as a whole. And this was a sneak peek of what was to come. So here we are today. Killingham and Summers have been rendered to jokes, with even Sanji and Frankie talking about how balmy they were last chapter. Like, they literally, like, yo, we're a Yonko crew now, bro. These dudes can't fuck with us. Sanji like, damn, I would expect the fighting force from the Holy Land to be a little bit stronger, but it happens. Interesting. It's a very interesting conversation, but we may need to pump our brakes a little bit on the Gods Knight slander. So the two main stars of our current lineup of Gods Knights haven't been shown to be frauds yet. This would be Shamrock and Gonko. Now, this could be a little copium, and you might sense a lot of copium in this video, but I really do believe that there is much more to these Gods Knights, strength-wise and character-wise, than what we've gotten so far. I believe Shamrock will be an extremely strong character. And I know, Garling turned out to kind of be bummy. I shook my camera with that because I'm passionate about how much of a bum Garling looked like, but there's more to that conversation too. But either way, Garling turned out to be a bum, so, nothing is really stopping Oda from saying, yeah, well, Shamrock can be one too, but it's a little different with Shamrock, at least in my opinion. They're twins, and stated to have the same level of talent, at least at that point. Now, that was obviously a much weaker version of Shanks, but we can assume that Shamrock is also grown in strength. Maybe I've fallen for the aura form. That's probably what has happened. It happens all the time. But I genuinely cannot see Shamrock being a fraud. It's kind of tough to imagine that. And Gonko was the one who soloed the Straw Hats. So that feat and that portrayal of those two characters has yet to be negated by any type of performance. The only thing that happened to Gonko is her just being taken over by Emu, which doesn't do anything for her stocks in particular. That leaves us with Killingham and Summers, who kind of got turned out to be frauds. But have they really? I don't know. Let's recap our problem. Due to the story implications, we had a certain level of expectations for the Gods Knights, and they were set pretty high. People, like I say, some guys had the Gods Knights, maybe not all of them, but some of them at Admiral level. And some people would have told you that the crew as a whole would be able to rival or even be stronger than some Yonko crew. These expectations have not been met at all, right? Like, no, there's no argument there. So how does Oda solve this problem? Well, let's get to these solutions. So, solution number one. I think the number one way to save the perception of the God's Knights is to go ahead and establish a hierarchy. We probably shouldn't be looking at them like a monolith in strength and more like a crew of their own. Killingham and Summers are probably more like commanders in their own right, with Shamrock and Gunko being where you would have your captain and your YC1. Now, if you bring Shamrock back to command respect for the crew as a whole, as to be looked at as the captain, since he has also more than likely been promoted to Supreme Commander with Garland becoming a Gorosei, then you also allow Gunko to continue to shine. It changes the conversation. Now, judging the Knights as a whole because of Killingham and Summers could be like judging Kaido's crew as a whole based off of who's who in Ulta. It's like, yeah, they strong, but that's not really the needle for the crew. And I'm not sure if we ever were really supposed to look at these two as real powerhouses. They got the regen, they got broken abilities, but is their individual strength really something that was highlighted, right? Yeah, they beat a few giants. I think Killingham beat Wolf and Summers beat Saul. But like, who hasn't beat a giant at this point in the story? It's not a needle mover. Like, Shamrock left them to carry out a game that was set up in their favor and really was supposed to go by without really needing to fight the giant. Strength really hasn't been communicated to be Summers and Killingham's calling card. And like I said earlier, there could be copium here. But also, we haven't met all of the Knights. If Shamrock and Gunko are your stronger fighters, and we can, let's say, pull maybe two more from the rest of the Knights that could at least be as strong as Gunko, then as a whole, the Knights are a much more formidable force. And you're in a situation where guys like Killingham and Summers are kind of on your lower end of your strengths here, which in that position, these guys would be looked at as extremely strong and valuable characters. Because we can't forget, even with the way they've kind of been handled, like Summers has lost to pretty much every guy he's fought, but he's also only fought really strong people. And Killingham kind of got fodderized this chapter. They were able to bring Elbaf to heel. Like literally, nearly, they're extremely close. It took some very specific situations for them to have not damn near wrecked Elbaf. Killingham's army is probably the strongest and most convenient army that can be made on the fly. Jesus Christ, in One Piece. My watch is going crazy. And Summers is Summers. Summers is one of those, he's like fandom, but he is somewhat competent. He has a very broken ability, and his way that he's infused love into the way it works is extremely interesting, but he's just Summers, bro. I mean, I think that this would be more likely the solution, the hierarchy thing, right? To kind of change the way we look at the God's Knights, because like I said, if you just look at it like, hey, the God's Knights are a consistent level of strength all the way across, and that level of strength is the Summers and Killingham tier, then yeah, that would be a little disappointing. But if you look at it more so where Summers and Killingham are like the Usopp and Chopper of the God's Knights, and then at the higher end, you got people on the level of Shamrock and Gunko, the crew as a whole, and like I said, look at them as a crew, is a lot more respectable. But, and that's also ignoring that on top of the God's Knights, you have the Gorosei. That's 5 monstrous top tier fighters, assuming that Garland kind of matches up in strength with the rest of the Gorosei, which I have zero doubts that he will. Then you have a much more formidable entire force of the Holy Land. So I think that our God's Knights perception was a little frayed based off of who introduced us to them, which is Dragon. And I'm not making an excuse for this, but it's a real thing. Dragon introduced us to them. They're really strong. Like, if we just look at what they've accomplished, they are strong. Excuse me, but they've also kind of ran into the strongest beings in the verse. Garland gets beat by Rocks Dizabek. That's tough. Who's beating him? The one at God Valley, the woman, right, that was supposed to capture Shamrock or Shanks, whoever, was beaten by Whitebeard. And like, yeah, one shot, but it's Whitebeard. Like, I don't know. I think we need to kind of readjust our lens. And I think that, yeah, it's a fault of Oda because he kind of was everywhere with the way he portrayed them to be. But maybe expecting them to be that strong was kind of unrealistic. So The best way, I think, to really fix our view of the God's Knight is to kind of just establish the hierarchy, the strength tiers, and so we can look at them as a whole and know what to expect from the God's Knight. Now, the second solution is a little bit more interesting. Let's give Emu the ability to instantly amp the God's Knights under any circumstance they need. We don't really know the limits of the control. We don't know much about the covenant, the pacts, and the different details. So this happening isn't really that far-fetched. I imagine that Emu kind of shares a pool of their power with all of the God's Knights. Let's say the pool totals to be 100, right? Emu keeps 50% of that power to themselves and distributes 50 amongst the God's Knights in the Gorosei. But in necessary situations, he can take that 50 that he has, dial it back down to 20, because it ain't like he's doing shit. He's just sitting in the Holy Land for the most part, and amp the God's Knights to make them a lot stronger than what they are. I think that an instant amp for power in the night for the Knights would spell disaster for Elbaf and the Straw Hats specifically, because they've kind of started to underestimate them. Now, this could be a situation that could require that struggle and tension that One Piece fans have become so obsessed with since they heard their favorite YouTuber say it. By the way, I love Morge. There's no shot at Morge. It's more so a discussion about how fans take buzzwords from their favorite creator. And I'm not saying Morge uses it as a buzzword, but they make them into buzzwords and kind of rob it of its meaning. Because our tension is just thrown out now. Like, oh, tension, we need tension, we need tension. There's multiple ways to accomplish tension in an arc. Right? We had tension a few chapters ago with the kids almost walking out. Like, that was tension, and that didn't... The Straw Hats don't have... You know what? That's a tangent. That's a rant. Maybe that's a conversation for another video, but I love Morge. This ain't no diss to Morge. This is a diss to the way people don't really know how to analyze media for themselves, so they take YouTubers' words and that becomes their opinion, right? You don't have any... You can't explain it. You just heard a YouTuber say it. So like, nah, oh, that's how I feel too. But what do you actually mean when you say this stuff? Oh, you don't know. Exactly. So... this could be the situation that does require some struggle and evolution from our striders, because it is actually needed. We've learned from Gabon himself, Zoro needs to learn to control his haki. Sanji just needs haki power-ups in general. That's not to mention the other guys too at the lower end. Usopp, oh my goodness, that's a whole different conversation. So it's needed. I don't think he would be really dummy reversing. I wonder how I would say dummy reversing. I don't think it would be dummy reversing the Holy Knights, but it's got to be a similar amp. They might get the horns and the wings or whatever. But I think they keep their sense because of the covenant. They would keep their senses, and it wouldn't just be like a mindless demonic thrall. Now, this could raise the potential threat level for any knight at any given moment, because no matter what the situation is, Emu pops in and just boosts their power, could make every situation dangerous. And imagine this happening for those that are on the higher end, like Shamrock and Gonko. But we're kind of getting the idea of what it could look like through Gonko. Emu pops in, takes over Gonko, and makes them extremely strong compared to what she already was, which was strong. This is now like a different level threat than what it would have been if Emu never showed up. So imagine if that on a smaller scale can happen with the rest of the Knights, right? If he can do that, minus the possession, then we've got a real deal ball game. But as is usually the case, no one knows what the hell Oda is actually cooking. His greatest strength is kind of how unpredictable he is. He does things his own way. He is extremely unique as an author, but it's also sometimes come back and bites him in the ass, because you can get a situation where Kinemon survives Kaido's Kanabo because his body wasn't properly read. But I'm probably going to be bringing that up for the rest of time until One Piece is over. That's going to be my biggest go back to and use this as my way I'm gonna slander Oda. I'm not one of them dudes obsessed with slander Oda, but that shit was unforgivable. Anyway, what do you guys think Oda is cooking with the Knights? I think that we have a very interesting ending to Elbaf setup, not to mention we still need to get to the Heaven Realm. So there are definitely a lot of questions that will be answered, a lot of questions that will be created. If you made it this far, I really appreciate you for tapping in. Of course, this is my first time dropping 2 One Piece videos within a week of each other if I get this out in time, so that's interesting. Consistency is key, and consistency is what we are going to be chasing. I appreciate y'all for tapping in. Like I just said, like and subscribe, and we will see you back very soon. I promise.